Welcome to the Radical Anthropology Group. Just a few of you, if you may have been expecting a different speaker, Duncan is ill. He was going to be telling us about the Hadza and other hunter-gatherers and trying to work out what enables them to be egalitarian. And but anyway, he contacted me to say he's ill, and we now have Ian Watts. So I think I met Ian for the first time in something like 1989, and at that stage, Lionel Sims, who is also among us this evening, was the kind of usual speaker at an event organized each year, a kind of jamboree called Marxism, organized by the Socialist Workers' Party. And Lionel was the speaker really on anthropology and in general, and in particular, on the origin of the family, private property, and the state. And Ian was at this event and met up with Lionel, and Lionel introduced Ian to my PhD thesis, which I think I'd just completed a year or two earlier. And Ian got persuaded by the argument that I'd been making about the human revolution and the fact that the signature of that revolution was likely to be the world's first form of symbolism in the form of ochre. But Ian very, very quickly pointed out that I'd got all my dates wrong, and that probably the origin of human culture, the human revolution as we called it, had nothing to do with the Upper Paleolithic revolution, so-called revolution of about 40,000 years ago, and must have started in Africa a lot earlier. It's a pity I didn't listen to Ian more carefully, because in the end I wrote my book Blood Relations with all the wrong dates in it. But what I did say to Ian was that I'd make a prediction, which is that if some digging was done in Africa, and you found people, Ian or anyone else found the evidence of this massive human revolution, the first evidence for art and symbolic culture, it would take the form of red ochre. And so one of the ways I want to introduce Ian is simply to say that Ian became part of the team led by Chris Henshelwood at Blombos Cave and the tip of South Africa, which around the turn of this century discovered the world's first art. And lo and behold, it did take the form of brilliant blood red ochre, shaped in this case into crayons, evidently for using to produce red colored designs on the body. So the world's first art was body art, and any pictures would have been on the body, which would explain why they haven't survived. But then what Ian is also well known for having done, apart from being really the world's #1 specialist in the ochre record of human evolution, was to get to know the Hadza and become an expert on African hunter-gatherer archaeology in general, including mythology and cosmology. And for me, one of the finest things Ian did was to write a chapter in a book about time, qualities of time, called Time 2 Grows on the Moon. And this was all about the centrality of lunar periodicity to the cosmologies and rituals, and to some extent hunting practices of African egalitarian hunter-gatherers. This evening, he's going to be talking about that, and in particular about what's probably the most exciting of all the discoveries, which Ian is increasingly being partly making, but partly just digging up from records which have previously been ignored, which is that the most productive form of hunting for many African hunter-gatherers turned the season of scarcity, the dry season, into a season of abundance, with a particular form of hunting which depended centrally on the light of the moon. And we're going to learn all about that now. So over to Ian.
Thanks, Chris. If the main story of the evolution of genus Homo over the last 2.5 million years is increased brain size, then the evolutionary narrative behind that concerns the behavioral adaptations that made this possible. In the abstract, big brains may be a good thing to have, but they're costly. For us Homo sapiens, a quarter of the energy needed to maintain resting metabolic rate goes to the brain. Among children, this increases to 2/3. So during pregnancy and infancy, these costs fall exclusively on mothers. And even with early Homo, they were way beyond what she could meet through her own foraging effort. Mothers had to draw upon an ever-widening circle of others. Now, important parts of the story are the evolution of grandmothering and increased dependence on high-quality foods, particularly animal fat and meat. At a relatively late stage in the story, cooking becomes important from about 400,000 years ago, making available a greater proportion of the energetic value of food before digestion. In our lineage, this ended up with the symbolically structured sexual division of labor, a key characteristic of which, among immediate return hunter-gatherers, is the institution known as bride service, where a man surrenders the product of his hunting labor to his in-laws. Now, the sex strike or female cosmetics coalitions model of symbolic cultural origins informing this evening class is primarily concerned with the later stages of female strategies to mobilize male labor. Now, I wanted to show you a brain chart, a chart of fossil brain sizes in Africa over the last 1.5 million years, but I haven't quite got that organized. But basically, within the general trend of increase, we see 3 periods of what look like step-like or stepwise increases. The first with post-Homo erectus populations. Homo in Africa, either Homo heidelbergensis or Homo rhodesiensis, from around 750,000 years ago. The second is with early Homo around 320,000 years ago. Now, by early Homo, this means that they had a modern face, but didn't have a modern brain case. And the final period of increase, with later Homo sapiens, is around just under 200,000 years ago, when a modern, that is to say, globular brain case is first seen. So tonight, I'm going to be addressing some of the behavioral changes that made these last increases possible. And I'll be proposing that lunar phase-locked hunting in the late dry season of African savannas played a critical role in the second and final phase of our morphologically diagnosed speciation, that one just after 200,000 years ago. The argument's not entirely new. We very tentatively made the proposal 25 years ago, shortly after we'd heard how important this kind of hunting was among the Hadza of Tanzania. But nobody's developed the topic since then. And I'm going to begin to do this here, focusing largely on developments that make it more relevant and more testable than when first proposed. I'll start by reminding you why lunar periodicity plays an important role in the sex strike model, and then go straight into a summary of what's known about the moon among African grassland hunter-gatherers, touching on why it's been overlooked for so long. Then I'll be considering some background evolutionary issues relevant to the seasonality of the technique, and review relevant aspects of the archaeological record. Finally, if I have time, I'll consider some of the ways that this eminently practical activity might relate to symbolic practices and beliefs among these same African hunter-gatherers, both the Hadza in Tanzania and Bushmen in Southern Africa. So, the sex strike model. I'll leave aside the tantalizing question why, uniquely among higher primates, women's average cycle length, particularly during peak reproductive years, is the same as the lunar synodic month, 29.5 days. I'll leave it aside simply because no progress, I think, has been made since Chris first developed the model. No progress on that issue. The critical role of lunar periodicity in the initial conditions posited by the sex strike model arose from two main considerations. First, female coalitions seeking to maximize the effectiveness of their strike action needed to synchronize across a vast landscape in order to prevent would-be philanderers from going off in search of fertile females elsewhere. And the only natural cue of anything like an appropriate periodicity would be the moon. Second, with the purpose of the strike being to mobilize male labor in logistically organized collective hunting of medium to large animals, hunters would need to optimize available natural light, as the hunt might involve overnight stays away from a home base. The optimal time for hunting, therefore, would be when moonlight takes over from sunset, in the second quarter of the waxing moon. Assuming the simplest possible division of time, this implied that the strike action should begin at dark moon and end with the successful return of the hunters around full moon. This generated the time-resistant template to the mobilization of ritual power that you're probably all familiar with. A periodic alternation between blood-defined kinship solidarity, dark moon to full moon, and honeymoon, full moon to dark moon. Now, in blood relations, Chris was only able to assemble some scattered ethnographic evidence for human nocturnal hunting. And the very limited claim he made was the expectation that evolving hominids should have the flexibility to exploit extended natural light available in the second quarter of the waxing moon, whether to travel overnight or extend hunting. Ethnographic predictions weren't made about hunting techniques or timing, only that if lunar periodicity figured at all in normative beliefs relating to hunting, it should be consistent with this logic. Now, shortly after Blood Relations was published, we heard Kristen Hawkes give a talk on Hadza hunting. The Hadza are a small group of hunter-gatherers living in the Rift Valley, in the Rift Valley's Eyasi Basin in northern Tanzania. In the 80s, they'd attracted the attention of evolutionary-minded behavioral anthropologists, behavioral ecologists, because they're the only surviving low-latitude hunter-gatherers focusing on medium to large animals. They're hunting focusing on medium to large animals. And the burning debate at the time was whether early Homo, almost 2 million years ago, was hunting or scavenging the very large animals represented at sites like Olduvai Gorge, and whether home bases could be inferred from that early. This work was pioneered by Henry Bunn. Kristen Hawkes and colleagues started with similar concerns, but soon focused on the question of why men hunt, questioning the standard assumption that it was to feed themselves and their immediate family. And what they did was to compare the return rates for different kinds of meat fat procurement over different seasons. Now, the three main strategies amongst the Hadza were scavenging, primarily a dry season activity, daytime pursuit hunting, and nocturnal ambush hunting from blinds by waterholes in the late dry season. Hadza bow hunting for large animals involves the use of poisoned arrows. What they found was that the return rates from these techniques, well, that they compared them with those if the Hadza had focused on hunting small animals, something that they don't normally do. Now, the small game hunting experiment showed that this was the optimal strategy if men were prioritizing provisioning of nuclear families. It was purely a byproduct of this work that they were able to demonstrate that nightstand hunting was more than 3 times more successful than the combination of scavenging and pursuit hunting over the same season, the dry season, more than twice as productive as scavenging or pursuit hunting over all seasons, and about 50% more productive than wet season scavenging pursuit hunting. Almost half of the large animals annually killed or scavenged were obtained in the 3 months of the late dry season. Now, this is partly because as graze quality deteriorates on the surrounding grasslands of Serengeti in the dry season, the Eyasi Basin sees a peak in animal biomass. So peak hunting returns could be expected at that time. Now, Henry Bunn's team, working at the same time, reached a similar conclusion, but they further specified that nocturnal ambush hunting typically took place on moonlit nights. This all came as quite a shock to us, as the social anthropologist James Woodburn had been writing about the Hadza for over 20 years and had scarcely mentioned the technique. Bunn provides a nice summary of ambush hunting by waterholes. Hadza hunters, either singly or in pairs, spend moonlit nights at these localities in anticipation of getting a relatively easy, close range, i.e. 20 meters or less, shot at a large animal, including zebra, impala, or hartebeest. The hunters wait in ambush in recurrently used spots, including trees above game trails, rocky ledges overlooking swampy waterholes, and artificially constructed blinds. A typical nocturnal ambush hunt involves walking to the blind around sunset. A fire is built in the fire pit and allowed to die down to embers. The hunter gets settled into the blind and leans several poisoned arrows against the wall of the blind. Then there may be a long period during which the hunter waits for the moon to rise and listens for the sound of approaching animals. The hunter may fall asleep, but the sound of the clattering hooves of animals walking on the rocky ground is usually sufficient to wake him in time to prepare for a shot. At dawn, the hunter leaves the blind to track any wounded animal or to walk back to camp. Now, from my very limited experience with the Hadza, I would add just 3 further observations. First, on arriving at the waterhole, they'd throw some stepping stones onto the marsh in order so they could check for recent spoor. And they told me that they did this to reduce the chances of leaving a scent. And the fire wasn't lit in the blind itself, but well back in the bushes. And some live coals were then transferred to the small fire pit in the blind and partially tamped down with soil to eliminate flame and smoke. And the original fire extinguished. And third, the semicircular blind was partially cut into the soil at the base of a tree, reducing the above ground height of the blind by about 15 to 20 centimeters. And to the range of potential ambush, Hadza ambush locations, James Stevenson adds the simple expedient of flattening some tall grass and leaving a standing periphery adjacent to a game trail. Now, Henry Bunn's quantitative data spanned the period from October to mid-December 1986, with the first rains falling at the very end of October Of the 26 medium to large animals obtained, 13 were obtained in October. That's half. 8 of these were obtained by nightstand hunting: 4 impala, 2 zebra, a buffalo, and a wildebeest. Sorry, a hartebeest. That compared to 4 procured by daytime hunting: 2 warthogs, a baboon, and a buffalo, and 1 where the technique wasn't specified, a kudu. Now, correlating the dates with lunar phase, only just over half of the successful nocturnal ambush hunts were actually during moonlit nights from second and third quarters, as 3 of the 4 impala were killed on moonless nights. Now, the reasons the technique is so productive are straightforward. With surface water in the dry season reduced to just a few locations, animals have to aggregate around those locations. The competition within and between species for access to the water, together with the thermoregulatory and water budget costs of daytime drinking, mean that many species choose to drink at night. Moreover, they tend to approach the waterhole by well-trodden game trails. So search time is eliminated. You wait for the animals to come to you, with a good chance of being within remarkably close range. A Hadza bow is large and is accurate up to about 50 meters. One's estimate of average distance in ambush hunts was less than 20 meters. Now, these findings in the late 80s, early 90s had been presaged a decade earlier by Crowell and Hitchcock, working with Kalahari Bushmen, who were also using poisoned arrows, but much smaller bows. Unfortunately, their 1978 paper appeared in an obscure journal that attracted no attention. Now, they were graduate students of Alison Brooks and John Yellen, who in the mid-70s were conducting archaeological excavations around the margins of Gi Pan, one of the few waterholes in the Dobie area of the northwest Kalahari, retaining water into the dry season. This pan had a number of semicircular stone features distributed around it. During the second season of excavation, Zhu Huanxi assistants modified a pile of back dirt from the excavations to form a hunting blind. And it was this that led Crowell and Hitchcock to interview the men, recollecting their use of such structures, both at Gi Pan and other pans and salt licks in the area. They then undertook similar research with another Bushman group further to the east, the Kaichwa, living along the Nato River. Once again, use of blinds was restricted to moonlit nights in the dry season, and typically involved 2 to 3 men occupying different blinds. The 13 blinds around Gi Pan had a mean distance to the nearest game trail of just over 3 meters. And inclusion of the second nearest game trail still provided a mean distance of just 6.5 meters. The Dobie Bushmen recalled getting rowan, which is a large antelope in the hartebeest family, kudu, and much smaller duiker. Migratory species such as wildebeest and zebra had become locally almost extinct. The Nato River hunters got wildebeest and buffalo. Unlike the Hadza, both Bushman groups also brought along spears, and the Dobie informants said that this provided them protection from lions. Along the Nato River, spears were sometimes used to kill wildebeest, where they could be trapped against the steep river bank. Crowell and Hitchcock noted that diurnal pursuit hunting of large game in this season was minimally productive. And so they proposed that ambush hunting may formally have provided the easiest method of obtaining large animals during this time of year. but they saw this in historical rather than evolutionary terms. The obvious evolutionary point is that before the invention of bow and arrow technology, this technique would have been even more important. Steve Churchill undertook a global survey of ethnographic literature on the effective distance of a thrown spear and found it to be about 10 meters. There's some subsequent experimental data combined with re-evaluation of the ethnographic sources suggests a range of 15 to 20 meters. As with the Hadza, this form of hunting had been entirely overlooked over the previous 20 years of very intensive Bushman research, including that by Richard Lee, one of the first ecologically minded anthropologists. By the 70s, for a host of reasons, the technique had become of marginal importance. However, unlike the Hadza, there's a large body of ethnohistorical literature documenting the technique, which has largely been overlooked. The reason we have this ivory boom, which in turn owes much to the invention of the upright piano. It was overwhelmingly moonlit ambush hunting by Europeans that decimated the elephant and rhino populations of Southern Africa. Now, I can't go into detail of this here, except to say that these sources provide an incredible wealth of detail concerning seasonality, the animals that came to drink, the number of animals, their quality in terms of fat, the use of salt licks, the importance of lunar phase, the construction of blinds, which are ideally partially sunk into the ground, which ethnic groups are responsible for existing blinds, predominantly Bushmen, but everyone did it, and the danger from lions. Just a few observations will suffice. On September the 9th, 1854, 3 nights after the full moon, James Chapman, at a pan in the eastern Kalahari, reported, no less than 100 head drank every 5 minutes from before sunset till after sunrise, which in 10 hours would make the number 12,000. The pool was all night in commotion with splashing, clattering hooves, lowing and moaning of gnus and braying of quokkas. Gnus are wildebeest and quokkas are the extinct and recently extinct zebra. Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, traveling in what's now eastern Namibia during the height of the 1851 dry season, had to occasionally kill one of his sheep because, quote, all the game was very dry, and where you have no vegetables, fat becomes an essential element of food. He also reported that 2 native hunters had recently been killed by lions while sitting in their hunting blinds. In 1850, Gordon Cumming wrote, I remarked a fact with the lion's hour of drinking peculiar to themselves. They seemed unwilling to visit the fountains during good moonlight. Thus, when the moon rose early, the lions deferred their hour of watering until late in the morning. And when the moon rose late, they drank at a very early hour in the night. Something else emerges from these accounts, not captured by 20th century census data, which is that many species would also drink during dark moon, although it seems that this was most common for elephant and rhino, and to a lesser extent, buffalo. The implication is that the human preference for full moon may have had more to do with our poor night vision than herbivore behavior, although as we'll see shortly, lion activity patterns also seem to have weighed heavily. All those directly and indirectly involved in the original Kroll and Hitchcock paper represented and updated their data in a more high-profile journal, which is all very welcome, although it's marred by some misleading citations for African archaeological evidence for hunting blinds, and the following remarkable statement. They use blinds mainly on non-moonlit nights in the winter, so the prey animals and other predators would not see them. I asked Bob Hitchcock about this direct contradiction to the original paper, and he kindly replied, I would change my conclusions in the light of additional interviews in June 2019 in Nyai Nyai. The hunters there say they do hunt on full moon nights so they can see the animals. They also say that they worry about lions, even though they realize that lions are mainly dark moon hunters. They say that they have seen them on both full moon and dark moon nights. Now, I'll turn now to the behavioral ecology literature on African waterhole use in the dry season. The most habitual nocturnal drinkers, as we get from the ethnohistorical data, are the mega herbivores, elephants and rhino, followed by buffalo. All three present a serious threat to a traditional hunter. The next species most likely to drink nocturnally is the eland, the largest African antelope. Based on the work of 4 research teams working in different locations across Southern Africa, anywhere between 18 and 50% of eland drinking was nocturnal. Hayward and colleagues concluded eland was the only herbivore that regularly used waterholes at night, although their data actually show that the trait was shared with elephant. Now, among epicures, the eland is famous for the sweetness of its meat, but among hunter-gatherers, it's also celebrated for having way more fat than any other antelope. In Kasiurungua's study, after eland, the next most frequent nocturnal visitors were hensbok, followed by small antelope, duiker and steenbok. Most studies also report nocturnal drinking by zebra and wildebeest. Numerically, these may be the most frequent visitors because they tend to arrive in large herds. In woodier habitats, other medium to large antelopes, rowan, sable, kudu, would also drink at night. And at the smaller end of the spectrum, in open grasslands, springbok in Southern Africa and gazelle in Northern Africa are also reported as night drinkers. Since Hawke's 1991 paper, one of the most significant behavioral ecology developments has been the quantitative demonstration of the extent to which lions rely on dark moon for their hunting. In Uganda, Tanzania, Kruger National Park, and Okavango. This simply corroborates the earlier anecdotal evidence. We saw from the historical literature and Bunn's Hadza data that potential prey species will also drink during dark moon nights, but there's no doubt that they're equally moon conscious. For example, gazelle are reported as lying down during moonless nights, while impala only graze once the moon has risen. I turn now to the evolutionary background. Seasonality imposes particular constraints on how calorific requirements can be met. A season of dietary resource stress acts as a limiting factor on reproductive success or reproductive rate and population size for herbivores and omnivores alike. In temperate and high latitude latitudes, it's a fairly invariant function of day length, but in the tropics and subequatorial zones, it has more to do with whether rainfall is seasonal. In interior Southern Africa, the dry season spans May to September, with rains concentrated in the summer months of December to February. In interior Eastern Africa, the dry season is slightly delayed, with the early dry from June to August and the late dry from September to November. In the late dry season, the fruit is generally finished. There's very little honey, and herbivores frequently can't meet their basic energy requirements through grazing or browsing and have to start drawing on fat reserves. Low latitude ungulates have far less fat than temperate or high latitude counterparts, and up to 10 times less than domesticates. A fat depletion is sequenced, with marrow fat generally the last to be mobilized. But with a prolonged period of low quality forage, it too will be mobilized. This is why we find accounts of Hadza and Bushman hunters in the dry season, having killed a large animal, the first thing they do is crack open a limb bone, only to find it dry and leaving the whole carcass untouched. Grassland and savanna hunter-gatherers, of course, have an important fallback food in tubers, available year-round. But these also tend to be of poorer quality in the late dry. They may also be harder to find and extract, with the leaves withered and the ground caked. Nor are they as calorifically dense as initial studies in the 80s suggested. For the Hadza, by weight, the proportion of tubers in their diet is lowest in the late dry season. So this raises an interesting problem. Investigating seasonal dietary shortfalls, archaeologist John Speth points out that you can be an effective hunter, but if there's little fat or carbohydrate about, you'll still die of starvation, as your body tries to metabolize energy from lean meat. This can be done, but it's metabolically very expensive. You need carbohydrates and/or fat to spare the protein. And carbohydrates are only marginally better than fat in doing this. Now, in a few favored habitats, the problem's reduced. The Juhuasi or Kung exploit mongongo nuts during this season. But this isn't an option for most Bushman groups. Some Hadza camps have baobab seeds, but others don't. Generally speaking, not much can be done about a dry season low in carbohydrate intake, or the absence of mongongo nuts or baobab seeds. But imagine if it were possible to successfully hunt far more animals than needed to meet protein requirements. You'd have access to that little bit of extra fat, whether it was any remaining organ fat or, more likely, remaining marrow fat. You'd have effectively turned a season of scarcity into one of relative abundance. Any dry season foraging strategy that even marginally enhanced consumption of high quality foods while sparing protein would be disproportionately advantageous. Now, the problems associated with the dry season are played out on a much longer time scale with glacial cycles, when so much fresh water is taken out of circulation. During our morphologically diagnosed speciation, there were two glacials, both considerably more severe than their immediate predecessors. One between 310 and 255,000 years ago, and the penultimate glacial from 195 to 127,000 years ago. For Africa, we've only got environmental proxies across the continent from 4 different zones for the last 150,000 years. And in that record, the only prolonged period of synchronous conditions was the aridity at the end of the penultimate glacial, from 150 to 140,000. But where we have earlier records from the Horn of Africa and from South Africa, these conditions extend more or less continuously to the beginning of the glacial at 195,000, with just one short humid interval. The implication is that just as maximum brain size in the Homo sapiens clade first appeared, African Eve, made famous by the genetic analyses, was thrown into an energetic crisis. And yet, remarkably, maximum cranial capacities stabilized during this glacial. When we come out the other side, in the last interglacial, average cranial capacity is 1,460 cubic centimeters. Now this contrasts with the Neanderthal trajectory, where brain size increase stalled during this glacial and was only completed in the last interglacial. Logically, therefore, in behavioral evolutionary terms, in Africa, during the penultimate glacial, we should expect some ratcheting up of female coalitionary strategies to secure more regular and/or more substantial provisioning with animal products from males. More specifically, intensive dry season hunting, harvesting more animals than required for protein requirements alone, with intensive processing of bone. So I'm now going to turn to the archaeology. Now, what archaeologists think is that at least along the Rift Valley, limited forms of presumably daytime ambush hunting probably go back about 1 million years. From at least 400,000 years ago, the ancestors of both Neanderthals and modern humans were capable of collective hunting of medium to large animals. Bison at Atapuerca in Spain, gazelle in the Levant. In the Levant, we have several sites indicating that this was habitual throughout the late Middle Pleistocene, extending to cattle and deer. But it's not until the late Pleistocene, beginning around 125,000 years ago, that we see widely distributed evidence for jump kill sites, other forms of collective drives, and the targeting of prime age adult individuals, all across a wide variety of habitats and species. Now, the timing's more likely to be an artifact of improved visibility and faunal preservation than of any major improvement in techniques. The zooarchaeological picture in Africa remains very poor for the late Middle Pleistocene. As elsewhere, the picture dramatically improves in the early late Pleistocene. And some of the best data comes from cave sites along the southern Cape Coast, most famously Classy's river mouth. There, the two most striking findings were, on the one hand, the high absolute and relative frequencies of eland and buffalo, totally disproportionate to their representation in the environment. And on the other hand, the differences in age profiles of the respective species. Young individuals were disproportionately represented among the buffalo. Now, adult buffalo are notoriously dangerous, but the ivory hunter James Chapman, back in the 1850s, provided the following provocative account from the northern Kalahari, close to the Boteti River. Here, the bushmen drive the buffaloes about dreadfully and kill numbers of young ones every day. Yesterday, a party killed 6. By contrast, the Classy's eland profile is dominated by prime age adults, indicating selection within a small herd, more consistent with some kind of ambush hunting. Focusing on late Pleistocene margin sites with fauna, virtually all of them, from the Free State in South Africa to North Africa and the Levant, have been interpreted in terms of selective hunting of prime age adult bovids and equids. I was going to go through those, but I don't think I have time. But where the season of use at these 7 sites could be determined, which was 5 of them, it was all the dry season. So the weight of evidence, particularly in terms of age profiles where available, was most consistent with some form of ambush hunting. Now, the most tantalizing archaeological evidence suggesting that ambush hunting may go back to the Middle Pleistocene. Can anyone see this? Further back? Yeah. This is a Middle Stone Age site excavated by Garth Sampson in the 1960s on the banks of a tributary to the Orange River, just where the valley narrows to a gorge. He found a sealed horizon which provided a cluster of semicircular structures with a rich scatter of MSA lithics. The structures, some on the original land surface and some enclosing areas slightly dug into the soil, comprise several tiers of cobbles, identical to the Guy Pan blinds and the more formal Hadza examples. And when published in 1968, there was no archaeological or anthropological literature on Bushman nightstand hunting. So Sampson presumed that they were sleeping hollows, despite having pointed out the advantageous location of the site for hunting. But in view of subsequent developments and the alignment of the structures to the stream, he now readily concedes that they were probably hunting blinds. However, in conference papers subsequent to the original publication, which have been cited by several archaeologists, he's raised doubts about the association of the MSA lithics with the structures. Now, I suspect this is just overcaution because so few MSA structures of any kind have been unknown. But the important point for me is that the site was sealed and no later Stone Age artifacts were reported. Unfortunately, no organics were found either, and the site is now submerged under the Van der Kloof Dam. However, it is worth pointing out that shallow man-made pits were reported by Vendorf and Schilt at the Paleo Lake site of Bir Tafawi in Egypt, dating back 135,000 years, where dry season hunting of gazelle was inferred. The excavators speculated that the pits were to reach water, but hunting blinds seem equally plausible. Now, going back to when we first see prime age adult mortality profiles, some 400,000 years ago, in Europe and the Levant, this is roughly when we begin to see the first repeated evidence for cooking fires and sites interpreted as campsites. Unfortunately, the African fire record from before 300,000 remains very poor, but there's no reason to infer any lag. In fact, the reverse seems likely. Given that some evidence for fire use goes back 800,000 and 1 million years, the increased visibility at 400,000 is probably best interpreted as marking a significant improvement of cooperation and trust rather than any technological innovation. However, in Africa and the Levant, but not in Europe, a strictly technological advance also broadly coincides with this period. The transition from the early to middle Stone Age, or Acheulean to Mousterian, where points and/or blades were added to the million-year-old tradition of hand axes and cleavers. In southern Africa, this new tradition is called the forest smith, and dated between 300 and 500,000 years ago. Now, on the basis of impact fractures and basal modification, some forest smith points are interpreted as having been hafted onto wooden spears. These first stone-tipped spears seem to have been used for thrusting rather than throwing, implying that hunting was still very dangerous. And it's only from about 300,000 years ago that we begin to see some points with weight, size, and symmetry attributes consistent with thrown spears. And by about 150,000, regional traditions of spear points can be identified. Now, the earliest evidence for bow and arrow technology also comes from Africa and is between 60 to 70,000 years ago, associated with the Howisson's Port variant of the Middle Stone Age. There's no reason to think it goes back any further. The earliest evidence for use of poisons is also African, from about 24,000. The residue of a plant poison found on an applicating stick from Border Cave in Natal. This probably does go back further, but how much further is anyone's guess. Before the bow and arrow, the primary hunting tool for medium-sized to large game would have been a spear with a stone tip. Thrust or thrown, the distance at which an animal could be seriously wounded or killed would have been much less than documented in the ethnographic record. There would have been a high premium on any technique that enabled you to get closer than 10 to 15 meters. Recall that the Guy Pan blinds were on average 3 to 6 meters from game trails. Now, as I noted earlier, the African fire record before 300,000 is poor, but what there is uniquely suggestive. Vonderwerk Cave is in South Africa's Northern Cape. The front of the cave provided evidence for fire use 1 million years ago. The back of the cave, some 150 meters into the hillside, is so dark that it can't be used without firelight, and there seems no practical reason for going there. There's no sign of its use until the Forest Smith. 3 or 4 Forest Smith sites in the region associate with the earliest evidence for pigment use: glittery specularite and red ochre. The presence of both at the back of Vonderwerk provides compelling indirect evidence for firelit, brilliant ritual display. This is probably the earliest evidence for any kind of ritual tradition, albeit at a local scale. From about 300,000, a few more widely distributed sites show regular use of red ochre, but Southern African cave and rock shelter campsites suggest that such regular use didn't become ubiquitous until about 170,000 years ago, during the penultimate glacial and shortly after the earliest case of a brain case, that's not very well put, the earliest brain case larger than 1,430 centimeters. Cubic centimeters, sorry. So just to emphasize that last point, regular ubiquitous use of red ochre in Southern Africa can only be inferred from about 170,000. So, discussion. Dry season ambush hunting is the most important hunting strategy involving lunar phase locking. But lunar periodicity undoubtedly played a wider role in the scheduling of hunting and traveling. In the Kalahari, pursuit hunting of eland or giraffe typically took 5 to 10 days. Being away from a home base for this long necessarily meant that such expeditions were likely to coincide with the waxing moon, with the corollary that hunters were likely to return at around full moon. Looking at hunting through the lens of lunar periodicity throws light on several features of Bushman and Hadza belief and ritual practice. The Hadza's most important ritual is the Apeme dance, exclusively held when there is no moon. The dance requires the participation of quite a few women, so it tended to be predominantly held in the dry season, the season when the Hadza aggregate close to remaining waterholes. One of the main reasons for holding the ritual is to help ensure the success of forthcoming hunts. This is why we were so bowled over by Kristen Hawke's casual reporting of the productivity of moonlit ambush hunting during precisely this season. Among the Bushmen, one of the most common occasions for holding a trance dance was the killing of an eland or a giraffe. Given the tendency for such hunts to be lunar scheduled because of their protracted nature, this presumably accounts for ethnographic reports saying that trance dances were most commonly held at full moon. For the Zegwi, an extinct Bushman group in eastern South Africa, the ideal form of initiating bride service was to surrender a male blesbok, a large antelope, at full moon. In the Drakensberg Mountains, a similar ideal was for a young man to drive an eland back to the edge of the camp before killing it. For the reasons just given, this was also likely to have occurred around full moon. Another line of evidence that eland hunting may have been disproportionately associated with waxing moon comes from one of the very few accounts of Bushman rock painting, where a postmenopausal woman was said to mix hematite with fresh eland blood over a fire at full moon. Remember that the eland is a more habitual nocturnal drinker than any other antelope, making it particularly vulnerable to ambush hunting. One of the most widespread Bushman beliefs was that the moon was not to be looked at when an animal had been hit. Otherwise, the fat would disappear or the animal would recover from the poison. The implicit link with ambush hunting is clear. And then there are the beliefs concerning a girl's first menstruation ritual, a ritual that, amongst other things, was also believed to help ensure the success of forthcoming hunting. The girl was generally only released from seclusion at the appearance of the new moon, upon which she would bless the younger hunters. In terms of Bushman beliefs directly connecting animals with the moon, one animal figures predominantly. You've guessed it, the eland. The Juhwasi value a vine for reasons that remain totally obscure, although it does have a beautiful cream or pale green flowers with purple blotches. When the moon is at its fullest and stands high in the sky, a wreath of this plant is twisted and hung around the neck of a hunter. The belief is that the hunter will meet an eland on the next day, shoot and kill it. The Gui believe that when the waning moon is in the morning sky, it affects the behavior of elands. When a soft wind blows from the direction of the moon, an eland is said to be so pleased that it will go on towards the moon, hopping again and again. Now, eland are also famous for having a massive leap. They can easily jump over any game fence. Consequently, a hunter can easily catch up with the eland in such a condition. Another Gui nocturnal connection between eland and night. The southern white-faced owl is believed to ride on the horns of an eland. When a hunter hears the grunt of this owl, he goes in its direction to find an eland. Finally, there are the creation myths. The Gui have myths concerning the origin of a sex-based division of labor, which are in the idiom of lunar periodicity. Either the moon was a man who hunted hartebeest once a month to feed his family, or the moon was the first woman who instructed the first man, who she created out of a fire, how to hunt for her. Or Kham myths from the Northern Cape, where the trickster or the water snake creates the moon and thereby allows bushmen to hunt at nights by waterholes. We have about 3 or 4 different versions of that story. So to conclude, initial experiments with lunar ambush hunting may go back around 500,000 years, but it's unlikely to have acquired any significance before about 300,000, when thrown spears seem first to have become available. The brain size story is that the earliest evidence for maximum brain capacities is at 195,000, precisely when the penultimate glacial began. The increase would of itself have placed maternal energy budgets under renewed stress. Its correspondence with a period of protracted greater aridity would have turned the annual dry season nutritional stress of grassland and savanna habitats into an adaptive crisis. I think this is the most likely period when hunting by the moon came into its own. I can't prove it, but the most compelling indirect supporting evidence is that this is when the Ochre record suggests symbolic ritual performance became pan-continental. Together, the two strategies turned a period of real scarcity into real abundance. That lunar phase-locked hunting must have played an important role in the evolution of modern humans in Africa is interesting in its own right and deserves much further investigation. But it takes on so much more significance when aligned with this beautiful abstract model of a unitary origin to human symbolic culture. Finished.
Bravo.
Thank you. Thank you for listening.
That was fantastic. It sounds like you're partly with your speaker's notes. Is that an article you're preparing for publication in the journal? What do you...
It is something I'm preparing for publication, yeah. For a festschrift for Lionel Sims.
Oh, I see. Oh my God! Wow, that's pretty amazing. That's fantastic.
Lionel's here. That's excellent. That's
Thank you, Ian.
I've lost your. All right.
Where's Lionel?
Yeah, he's there. He just said thanks.
Here I am.
brilliant.
Oh, I see. There's Lionel. Okay, just saw you there. So what do you make of that, Lionel?
Hold on, I'm trying to get.
You keep appearing and disappearing.
Sorry, hang on a minute. I can't do. There we go.
Yeah.
Can you see me?
Yeah.
Hello, Ian. Hello, everyone.
Hi.
Ian, thank you. Thank you. Lovely talk, Ian. Thank you.
Well, thank
Great.
you for everything. I mean, you made it possible in the first place.
Well, I'm sorry. I apologise. Spent your life buried in a library or in a cave. Yeah. No, I'm especially interested in what you're saying tonight because on my research is at the other end of the story that Chris, Camilla and Ian have been fighting for decades. I set myself the task of working out when it all collapsed and why it collapsed. Amazingly, in the last few months, just the last few months, I have found red ochre at Stonehenge and at Avebury. But this is red ochre that is secret. It is secret knowledge of a reversing cosmology that makes women's blood polluted, but men's blood as ritually powerful. And it's only in the last few months that I've understood this, found it in the archaeology, and interpreted it through the cultural astronomy that is built into the Stonehenge and the Avebury monuments. So as part of this research I'm doing at the moment, I'm going back to your work, Ian, because I want to be able to quote you about the symbolic significance of red ochres and red earths, which is what I found at Stonehenge and Avebury, is red earths, but they are secretly located and obviously part of the cult elite knowledge of the wealthy cattle herders who were running the show in the Neolithic round about 2500 BC. So Ian, I'm just going to be...
That's fantastic, Lionel.
I'm just going to be stealing everything I can from your work to be able to blame you for being able to translate the secret red earth at Stonehenge and Avebury as obviously, absolutely obviously, symbolising blood, but blood that is is politically manipulated by the builders of these Neolithic monuments. So Ian, thank you.
Thank you. That's great.
Fantastic. Oh, wow, it sounds as though we've actually got the entire story practically covered. I mean, there might be a few bits to fill in about the Upper Pale and the Mesolithic, but it sounds like it almost is. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Whether we will be well received, entirely another matter, because now I am totally paranoid now about the archaeology establishment globally, because we've heard some examples from Ian about how, well, who was it who said this? Who wrote The Naked Ape? I've forgotten his name.
Desmond Morris.
Desmond Norris. Desmond Norris once said in a lovely film in which he was being very generous to Elaine Morgan, thank you, Chris, when he says that there is a fine line to be drawn between scholarly caution and downright cowardice. You know, the agonies I'm going through trying to please archaeologists when I write a paper, it's just endless nitpicking is my experience of it all. And it's just a very tiring business to be able to write something well and at the same time to make sure that you're covering all of the possible gaps and all of the possible criticisms that are going to be raised by archaeologists who, to be fair to them, they are miniaturists. They have to be able to respect in the data that they excavate. But to then move from miniature archaeological data reports to then symbolic generalizations, that is such a difficult thing for archaeologists to do who do not come from an anthropological or ethnographic approach to culture, that the divide between archaeology and anthropology, which of course doesn't exist in America, but the divide in Britain is so vast that it is very frustrating to try and be patient and meet and reach out with a generous approach when you are continually being, you know, it's very difficult, I'm finding, to actually have a meeting of minds. So to be able to work in a research team in which the archaeologists are there with you. That's my request to Father Christmas. Was that too hard?
Did you want to say in a little bit more to explain why on earth this, I mean, it's kind of a no-brainer with the way you described it, the relevance of the moon. How it is that none of the standard narratives about human origins even once ever mention this object in the sky? I mean, really, I mean, can you just discuss that a bit and just try to tell everyone out there what's going on?
It's, I can just about understand it up until the 90s, up until Kristen Hawkes. You know, that it had sort of virtually disappeared from the South African literature. If they weren't aware of the ethno-historical literature, I can understand why they missed it. But these people generally do read within the field, even in slightly obscure journals like Botswana Notes and Records, which is where Kroll and Hitchcock originally published. And also, I mean, being charitable, I suppose the other thing is that when evolutionary behavioral ecologists got involved, sort of really from the 80s, they were primarily addressing early Homo. They weren't interested in more recent periods of prehistory. And so I guess they could justify ignoring the relevance of the moon on those grounds. I don't know. I mean, but no, there is no excuse. But it's very great that Kroll and Hitchcock and Alison Brooks and John Yellen have now published, even though it's largely just updating and republishing 30, 40-year-old data, they've now put it in somewhere accessible. So it can't be ignored in the way it has been. Particularly, I mean, they don't really integrate it with the Hadza material, but you know, when you put the two together, it's so obvious. I mean, I haven't really looked at African forest hunter-gatherers, the Mbuti, and it's obviously not going to be as relevant there, but I'm sure that once you start digging around, you will find stuff.
And what is also pretty extraordinary is James Woodburn not telling us about it. And we really ought to be trying to ask him still. I'm just going on through his thesis. He does talk about the waterhole hunting, but he doesn't mention moonlight. He just talks about it as part of the dry season. And he's not talking about the nighttime.
Yeah, and he does mention, it's just like a passing mention. I think he only goes as far as saying, you know, that big game hunting is most productive in the dry season. Apart from that, it's just a passing mention to ambush hunting.
Yeah, exactly. And if you get to talk with him, and he'll tell you stuff about eland and the fact that they can hunt eland when it's not full moon when it's not moonlight at night, because of the noise that the big bull eland makes with the tendons, with the clicking. And I'm wondering about your Bushman story about the owl and the eland and the noise that the owl makes. Whether that links at all to that idea is an interesting.
I mean, one priority is, you know, it's the tragedy that Frank Marlowe died.
Yeah.
But you know, he's got the biggest body of data on Hadza hunting, and you know, within his records there will be a wealth of stuff on nightstand hunting. And one of his former students, we need to approach them and obviously his daughters as well, about how to get about Frank Marlowe, and integrating Frank Marlowe's records with ideally, hopefully, with James's records, and getting funding for that kind of a project.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Brian Wood and Colette would surely be amenable. I think Colette would help a lot.
Yeah, I don't know Colette.
Oh, we know Colette. She's spoken out. I mean, she's at Roehampton, so I'm sure So she did a lot with Frank, and Brian Wood obviously would have a lot of the stuff, I would have thought.
We've got a lot of participants. We had about 75 to start with. We've done a little bit now to 54, but there must have been lots of you out there who've got all kinds of questions. And can I sort of encourage you to be, you know, just asking anything really of Ian now that he's here. Has anybody got any comment to make or question? Don't worry about it being slightly naive. I mean,
can anybody hear me? I don't know if I've got a few.
I can. Yeah.
I think I've got a few technological issues here. So I wanted to clarify, Ian. I thought I heard you say a unitary emergence of symbolic culture, or did I mishear?
Yeah, but yes, you heard right. And what I meant was like that this abstract model unifies economics, sex, ritual, and cosmology. So in that sense, a unitary model.
Right. Okay. So
they're all together.
I wondered if you were talking about ochre, but obviously you were talking about more than that. But are you suggesting, rather than a multi-regional emergence of symbolic culture, you were suggesting a unilocal, if that's the right word, emergence of?
Well, sort of pan-African.
Right.
I think.
Okay.
That's the best way of seeing it.
And therefore a diffusion of ochre use.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, once we left Africa, and there's some debate about when this is and which lineages became extinct, but the archaeology suggests that it was probably, the earliest immigrants were maybe about 120,000, or in terms of still being connected to us today. But the important point is that the one thing that links the earliest modern human evidence in India, in the Americas, in Australia, with the African record is ochre use. It is a universal wherever there is ochre available. And where it's not available, they'll use plant pigments or whatever else they can instead.
Well, that's really interesting. So red pigment, if not ochre, something close to it.
Yeah.
But is there not evidence for a sort of independent emergence of a lot of other things like agriculture? I mean, obviously that's later, as I understand it, but much later.
Yeah. I mean, what? Yes, you're certainly right. That agriculture has many points of origin. What I'd say about what I was talking about tonight is that, in a sense, it wouldn't matter where you were in that penultimate glacial. You were all facing the same problem, and you all shared an evolutionary history of female coalitionary strategies, which had already been about sort of laying the basis for ritual behavior and probably playing around with blood, maybe not on a habitual basis, but using it as and when. And that what's happening in that penultimate glacial is that becomes crystallized and shared across the continent.
Around 120,000 years, you're saying? Am I right?
100
earlier.
170.
All right.
Saying 170. Yeah.
Okay, that's fascinating. I've got lots more to ask, but I'm going to give everybody else a chance.
Next week, I'm going to talk about the Neanderthal story on this one.
Excellent.
Okay.
Perhaps I could just come in response to Hugh's points. When Ian was talking about a unitary account of the emergence of symbolic culture, he made it clear he's referring to an abstract model, and that is what we call the sex strike model, or the female cosmetic coalition model. And I'll be very, very brief. It's just that when, in our view, a bunch of women acted to establish some things are sacred, namely our bodies, what they were doing was acting on a number of different levels simultaneously. So we don't need a separate explanation for all the different things. We don't need one explanation for the origin of economics, another for the origin of the sexual division of labor, another for the origin of religion, another for the origin of kinship. What those women were doing, they were establishing a principle which is operative on all those different levels simultaneously. And that's a different issue from when and where things in practice happen behaviorally. So Ian said real experts, as is Camilla in a slightly different way, on the sort of details of when and where particular strategies became evolutionarily stable. But what Ian's saying, I think, is that we have an abstract model. We don't need one theory for this, one theory for that, one theory for the other when it comes to symbolic culture. But of course, things don't happen all simultaneously, they don't happen all at once. But we don't just think we need completely different theories for each of those things, like a separate theory for the origin of language, or a separate theory for the origin of, say, religion or group level morality. Our theory is parsimonious. Because
Excellent. That's really helpful. Thank you, because really I'm a complete layperson as far as anthropology goes, and that's quite helpful. Thank you. So
can we have it? Is anybody else with a question in this very large group this evening?
Yeah, Jackie had a question about the hunter's moon.
Oh, what's the question?
Do you want to say, Jackie?
Yeah, hello. Hi, everyone. Yeah, we've got traditionally in Scotland, probably across the British Isles, in the full moon round about September and October is always called the hunter's moon. And it can often be quite red tinged. How ancient do you think that is?
Lionel, or Ian, or anybody.
Hopefully Lionel might have an idea on this.
I'm not sure I have.
What I can say is, although anthropologists and archaeologists have done a very good job of ignoring the topic, if you're in the States, where they're very keen on deer shooting, they know all about lunar phase-locked hunting.
Yeah.
So, and of course, you know, these things are seasonal. When you know, quite apart from the laws about when you can go hunting, you know, that partly relates to the condition of the animals. And it may also relate to the moon, the full moon at certain times of year will appear larger. But I don't know about
when Chris said it's a unitary model of culture and you don't need separate explanations for this, that, and the other, sex, economics, agriculture. Everything comes out of this explosion, this revolution, way back in the Paleolithic, when women collectively made themselves inviolable. That's how it began. And out of that sprang, at different places and at different times, regional versions of how that had to play out because of the circumstances that people found themselves in. If you now take that process back to its other end, its collapse, which is very unfortunate, but we went through a counter-revolution, and the Neolithic is the name of the counter-revolution. And there, when that happened, everything that previously had happened and had developed in various places all branched off in different ways. And at Stonehenge and Avebury, for example, any sort of ceremony around the moon was taken away from its monthly performance and was switched onto sometimes an annual or biannual solstice performance. And so there were all these adaptations to try and preserve a lunar logic, while at the same time that lunar logic was being undermined by the economic circumstances when big game hunting, thousands of years had failed. And therefore, for example, agriculture was one thing that had to develop to feed a population. And that cannot be organized around a lunar big game hunting logic. And so therefore, expressions like the hunter's moon, I would argue, are an adaptation to a culture that's trying to stay together, trying to use the old ways of respecting hunters, but where hunting is not a viable economic strategy. So what you do is you park them onto other events, which are not lunar, dark moon or full moon events. But in places, they're solstice events. In other places, they're on a 19-year cycle of lunar standstills. So in China, there was a 9-year cycle in the deepest ritual cycle. So therefore, the expression a hunter's moon, you're quite right. It is an important expression in folklore that is a memory, an echo, a piece of shrapnel left over after the collapse of the previous early Paleolithic systems, which were run according to a synodic lunar logic. But in the Neolithic, certainly, that had not only gone, it was actively being undermined by the monument builders. And folklore are like the popular engagement and like memory of these ancient logics that made us all human.
Hunter's Moon surely also has a simple seasonal explanation. The crops are in, you know, the fields are, as it were, empty. You've got a lot of moon because it's a high moon because it's an autumnal moon. So a full moon in autumn lasts much of the night and is high in the sky. This is quite a good time for hunting generally. I mean, for hare, for instance, you know, you've got a lot of young livestock that presumably can be taken more easily in early autumn.
Yeah.
When's the grouse season starts? Is that anything to do with the Hunter's Moon nowadays? I don't know.
That's out of my socio-economic class, I'm afraid.
No, I should be watching the crown.
August the 12th. It's a fixed date.
Well done.
But the game seasons are in the autumn, obviously. I mean, all the huntings, the game seasons come in the autumn. And John would be right about that. I think Lionel's absolutely right, but John's surely right also. That would be a particularly good time to try to collect animals which would have rich fat from the summer. So you'd want to get those animals for meat before winter, definitely, as much as you could.
Do we have another question from somebody who hasn't said anything?
There is Lampros Kalenos has a question about Michael Witzel's world mythologies. Lampros, do you want to say something? I don't know. He's muted. Lampros? No. Has anybody read Michael Witzel's book on common world mythology?
No, unfortunately, I haven't.
Do you hear me now, maybe?
I haven't read it.
Lampros, yes.
Hello, I hope you hear me.
Yes.
Can we see you?
I am actually reading.
Can we see you?
Yes, of course. It says I cannot start my window.
Oh. Sorry, what's that? Oh, okay.
Okay, not to worry.
Yeah.
I still get the same message. Yes, to start your window. Yes, start my window.
Oh, hello.
All right. So I am actually now, what's this? Yes, reading this book. Witzel claims he has found evidence all over the world, not only similar myths, but a similar storyline. Complete, all the mythologies can be thought as common. There is always a hero who kills a monster, then something happens, always the same. And he says the distances and the similarities of these mythologies, from Europe to Asia, up to America, point out that it cannot be by chance, it has to be by a common origin. And he put this origin before humans left Africa. So this goes back to 65,000 years. He actually identifies two groups of mythologies. One is Europe, Asia, and the Americas. The other is Africa, sub-Sahara Africa, Australia, Polynesia, which he used the name Gondwana. The other group he names Laurasia. These are terms used by biologists and paleologists also, and he adopts them himself. So these common forms, or these common mythologies, point out to a common origin at the time of this, let's call it the Eve, the primitive first Eve, 130,000 years. So these are stories told so much back. So I was wondering if you have
It's
in
our,
mind.
it's our specialist field. Lionel's field, my field, Camilla's field, Ian's field. And so we do.
I mean, we have to read it, because I mean, it sounds spot on. I mean, you know, there have been people who've been making this kind of claim going back. I think one of the first was the Russian.
Vladimir
what was his name?
Prop.
Vladimir Prop in the 1920s, and then of course Levi Strauss in the 60s and 70s was also advancing the same idea, and of course it was the basis of Chris's thesis, that indeed there are structural commonalities in the world's myths that can be decoded. So without having read it, I'm quite sure that there is a lot of merit in Witzel's arguments.
I mean,
You know, and obviously I have to read it and see how it compares to Chris's stuff, Levi Strauss, Prop, and so on. I suspect. I mean, you mentioned that a hero slaying a monster. That was also Prop's starting point as well. You know, dragon slaying myths, and he was focusing on Eurasian mythology. But you have that same motif in Bushman, and certainly Bushman mythology, the all-devourer.
I'd like to hear from Lionel on this one.
You heard of?
I think Lampros has made a good point. Witzel, everyone should read Witzel. He's unpopular amongst many academics because he's what we would call a lumper. He's not a splitter. He tries to bring everything together and trace it back to its source. And therefore, it will converge very closely to all of the things that are being said in this evening class. I've read it once quickly, and I felt unhappy with his data because I thought his account of the African myths was very sparse, and he instead concentrated on European and some Asian myths and Australian myths, but the African stuff was very slim indeed. And therefore, the actual narrative of the way in which he then tried to get back to the meta myth behind all of this grouping, he didn't manage to do it. In fact, he ends up with a split between the Gondwana land and the Laurentian regional groups that he finds. And he doesn't find the interaction behind these two groupings that he makes. And I think that's because his actual database of a lack of many rich African myths was just not there. And I couldn't understand why it wasn't there, you know, taking into account what his aim was in that book. Nevertheless, it's a book that everyone should read, and there's definitely a PhD there for someone to actually take his work further forward. I'm sure some rich work can be done.
Can I just remind everybody that Camilla wrote a chapter in Human Origins, Contributions from Social Anthropology, called A Source Cosmology for African Hunters and Gatherers, which you might be interested in, Lampros, because that fills in that gap to a large extent that Lionel was saying seems to be in there. Seems to be in there. I mean,
small bit.
Well,
small bit. It wasn't. It was mostly based in ritual rather than myth. But yeah. But one thing to add is to talk about some of the recent phylogenetic work, which has drawn on very large databases by people like Julien Douy and Jean Le Quellec, where they've grown a much bigger database of African stuff, I think. So they do analyses as well, but it's kind of from phylogenetic point of view of how can you trace back the family tree of these original motifs. But there was also recent work by some Australian guys who particularly looked at Aboriginal stories, but were also looking at astronomy and how the astronomy had changed over 1,000 years. And they were finding the myths of the Pleiades as central. So this is myths of 7 sisters, who always call 7 sisters, even though actually today we can only see 6, if that, of the Pleiades. And they're always being chased by hunters. So they're like women refusing sex. And this is supposed to have a 100,000-year time frame. So it would be roughly the right time frame of the little stuff of the out of Africa. It's worth mentioning those.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your comments.
Thanks.
Anybody else with a question? Come on, all of you. There's lots of you out there still. 50, I can see.
Oh. Helena is making an observation about if people don't distinguish between night and day hunting, they wouldn't if they're not interested in the moon. It baffles me why behavioral ecologists wouldn't do so, because I'm not quite sure I agree with Ian that the Hawkes team, O'Connell, etc., were only looking at early Homo. They, in respect of grandmother theory and so on, and scavenging, perhaps that's true, but they were also looking at the show-off hunting, the costly hunting and so on, which wasn't about early Homo. So it's a bit remarkable that they didn't bring together this very successful ambush style hunting as part of the story. They didn't relate it to the moon. It's very extraordinary.
That hostility that Lionel was describing earlier on, there's no question that hostility is just a very deep-rooted part of the university system in this country, but right across Europe, really, which, of course, all of our universities were once theological colleges. And there's a huge worry among the Christian bishops and theologians and people about the moon, as well as about women, and especially about menstruation. So, and these things linger on. So there's not much doubt that patriarchy's sort of stock in trade terms like, moonshine, it's moonshine, it's lunacy, it's all those things, they're very much around still. And people who just feel a little bit upset or angry or whatever it is about our way of reconstructing the whole history of humanity, it's so easy for them to just reach for the shelf and find one of these put downs, and they do. When I mentioned at the beginning that Ian first met Lionel at a conference of called Marxism of the Socialist Workers' Party. Well, when Ian tried to get his people in this organization to see how, to what extent this theory vindicated one of their own inspirations, Frederick Engels, The Origin of the Family, Private Property in the State. They were initially quite keen until they realized that it was something to do with women and women's solidarity in particular, and horror of horrors, the possibility that women might actually organize separately and even go on strike. And so when one of their main gurus replied to an article by Lionel, I think it's how it worked. Lionel had spoken on the theory and so on. The title of this article was "Menstrual Moonshine." The final line was, "Why do Marxists need to worry about moonshine?" So it's just so quick and easy to reach out to those put downs, and they just do. They do. And it's just tragic that a thing as central as the fact that we are an Earth, Sun, Moon system, and that, you know, the evolution of life on Earth as a whole reflects the fact that we're an Earth, Sun, Moon system. You know, three sort of heavenly bodies whirling around each other. The fact that you can sort of remove one of these bodies, the moon, and still think you're doing science is tragic. It's absolutely tragic. There wouldn't be any life on this planet without the fact that there was a huge collision between two planets, you know, and the moon is one of the results of that. Everybody, all scientists know that the initial rhythm, which, you know, set up not just the tides, but tectonic plate movements and the Earth's magnetism and so many, I mean, you know, so there wouldn't be life on Earth without the moon. And yet they can just say, oh, well, we're a bit worried about this moon, you know, it's got something to do with women, moonshine, menstruation, whatever. And it's tragically unscientific, but there it is. These people put their religious politics, however buried, half conscious it is, they put this religion first.
I would say it's a little more complicated, because I think there is some secret patriarchal moon worship going on through. Do you hear me?
No. No.
You cut out.
Oh, okay, let me try again.
I can hear you now.
Okay, so I think there was some secret patriarchal moon worship going on through the Enlightenment. If we consider the history of the Royal Society, a large part of this was about the astronomy required to measure the movements of the moon in order to discover longitude. And at the same time as all this was happening amongst these male scientists that were ganging together into the sort of the initial formation of the Great British Empire, at the same time, women were being rendered hysteric, being called moonstruck and you know, all the usual irrational hysteric in the Enlightenment kind of logger, whatever it is. So there is some sort of secret society in this science of the moon that still was there, even if it wasn't that they didn't talk out.
It was Erasmus Darwin, wasn't it? It was belonged to the Lunar Society, right. And the lunatics, and Erasmus Darwin. They
rode to their meetings by the moonlight, and they were able to ride back because the moon was in the sky. Yeah. So they've kept this secret going.
There's also the not so secret British Army, because they have night vision amplification built into their helmets, so that whenever the British Army launches a battle, it's always at dark moon, because like lions, they then have night vision and they put their enemy at a disadvantage. So certain aspects of the moon are quite amenable to the patriarchs today.
Military, longitude, anything that furthers the cause of the imperialism.
Exactly. Are we losing the audience?
Well, we're going down to 46. We're slightly. One or two people have walked off in disgust, I think. No, I'm really joking.
You can reverse that as well in relation to the Bushmen. When they were dealing with European colonization in the 1700s and early 1800s in what's now the Cape, they'd do a lot of cattle and sheep stealing, and this would generally be done during dark moon, or better still, towards the end of waning moon, so that when they raided, it would be dark, but they'd have some light once they'd got sufficient distance between them and the farm they just raided for the rest of the return journey.
Okay. Any more questions?
Can I ask a question? Just about, because you mentioned the spear, the arrow-headed spears. I just wondered, because of course they're a lot older than the other forms of hunting. I just wondered when the kind of use of these arrowheads as ritual had ritual uses, which, because you found some, or there's some in the archaeological record of these spearheads which have been burnt to look red.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wondered when they date from, and also things like barbed harpoons as well. I mean, were they in use in Africa? Because there's some use of those in Australia, and also to kind of bring Australia into this a little bit. And is there evidence of this night hunting over there as well? So
yes, yeah. First of all, the ritual use of spear points or very large arrow points in southern Africa has been dated at around 80,000, 60 to 80,000. And around that same time, you have particular localized traditions of very fine bifacial working of points, to the point where you're beginning to think these are not functional. They're too delicate. In industries like the Still Bay, which is also about just over 70,000. So that was one of your points. Australia, Chris, in Blood Relations, he does have a little bit of referencing to Australian night hunting. I've forgotten who it was now, but it was significant. Although most of the animals being caught that way, I think, were generally smaller. And again, it has, as far as I know, it hasn't been further researched. Yeah, maybe that was it.
Well, we could sort of wind up more or less now, unless anyone else has got something they want to ask. Any final question from anybody?
Yeah, could I ask about? Yeah, hiya.
Go on.
The stuff about red ochre. I mean, I'm presuming that by reading your book, I would get a good understanding of this. But I just wondered if you could sort of do a basic outline of what this was about, in terms of it being the first art, and how this tied in with the expression of the sex strike, because it's like you, it's all new to me. I'll read the book, but if you were able to give me some,
I think Camilla is probably the best person to address that.
All right. Really briefly. Can you hear me again? Because my
yes.
Okay, I am going to do it next week with the Neanderthals, actually.
Okay.
But the fundamental thing is, what Ian said about women's difficulties because of this extremely large brain size increase. That means women have to find much more energy to support these very large brained offspring. So that's why they're going to put pressure on men to start investing much more. Yeah, they're going to try and do things for themselves first, but then they're going to get men involved. But the issue is, how do you influence men? Okay, well, the surefire technique is to use sexual signals, all right? Men are interested in sex. If you can use sexual signals, then that'll help. But what's happened in our evolution is we have lost any direct sign of fertility. We've lost any sign of ovulation. Now, that may be quite a long way back in our history, actually, even before Homo, possibly. So men cannot tell when a female's fertile. You might think you can, but you can't. Evolution has made it that way. And that's a very good idea, because from the female point of view, because otherwise a man could just turn up at the time when a woman's fertile get her pregnant, and then go and find another one. Okay, so a woman doesn't want that to happen if she wants a man to invest extra and support her more. So concealed ovulation and continuous receptivity, having lots of sex around the cycle, is part of the evolutionary solution to kind of maintaining the pair bond and keeping men kind of hanging around if men are useful. Ian's been telling us the ways in which men became increasingly useful. But there's a fly in the ointment, and the fly in the ointment is menstruation, that we have a very copious menstruation. Now, menstruation isn't marking the precise time of fertility, but if you have a group of females who are pregnant, breastfeeding, or older menopausal, then a female who's menstruating, as far as a male who's a dominant or alpha male is concerned, that female, she's the one to latch onto. She's the one to get hold of. Therefore, menstruation is the cause of difficulty amongst the females, conflict, if some females aren't menstruating and other females are, and difficulty amongst the males. There's going to be conflict amongst the males. So the argument is, what was the solution for this is what we call female cosmetic coalitions, which would have been the expression, the ritual expression of the sex strike. So instead of trying to hide signals like concealed ovulation, you say, well, if one woman's menstruating, everyone's menstruating. You cosmeticize the whole thing. So you just you borrow the blood, you borrow paint, you use ochre, whatever it is, and you present a united front. It's an expression of solidarity amongst that coalition. So that's the basic model. And there are all kinds of reasons from Darwinian evolutionary theory, sexual selection, why the males who are willing to invest, they will want to select the females that are doing cosmetics like that, because those females are basically saying no to dominant or alpha males who are not going to do the bride service with the elans that Ian's been talking about. So that's where the cosmetics and the ochre comes into it so much.
Tam, I gather you're quite well known up where you live in Glasgow as a carrier of the red flag.
Yeah.
Is that true? So that's where it all started. The red flag.
Red flag.
Red has always been the colour of insurrection, the colour of solidarity, the colour of communism.
Right. Communism. Yeah. Picket line. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Well, I shall have to tune in next week, I think, Camilla, to
yeah, we're going to talk about Neanderthal sex strikes and
excellent. Yeah.
And okay. Lionel, when are you going to talk a bit more about your discoveries?
I've no idea. You'll have to ask Camilla and Chris about that, Tam.
Well, I think it should.
It's possible. Yeah.
It's possible. I'm just thinking. I mean, we've got this term's syllabus pretty much fixed, haven't we? But I mean, if you're up for doing it after Easter straight away, Lionel, let's hope you're well. Definitely, and unless we can think of some, switching to this term syllabus, which might be possible.
No, I could step into my slot. I'd be happy to move it.
No, you're on next week. Don't get up.
No, but I've got another one later that can go after Easter.
And I have very low energy levels, so I'll need some time to develop something. But thank you, and thank you for asking, Tam. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. We've probably sorted something there. So probably Camilla might be giving way on her next talk to you, Lionel. I can't quite remember what the date is.
It's March the 30th, but it's up to Lionel.
Let me think about it, because I'd have to prepare, and I don't have much time where I can work at an optimum.
Yeah.
Right.
So sometime yet.
Yeah. Okay, so thanks everybody. I think we'll call it a day, an evening. Thank you very, very, very much, Ian. That really was brilliant. It was fantastic, absolutely fantastic. And it's great that it's in the festival for Lionel coming on quite soon. So really, really amazing stuff. Amazing how it's all come together. Really, congratulations, Ian. Yeah.
Oh, thanks.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's lovely.
Thank you.
That's
Great. Well
Bye.
done, Ian.
Bye.